Election 2012 is now behind us, but that doesn't mean we don't have some issues to discuss surrounding the Tuesday vote. Senator Chris Coons is our first person this week. Senator, thanks for taking the time to talk with us here in our first studios. Appreciate it.
Thanks for a chance to be with you.
Well, Senator Coons, I was at the Delaware Democratic Party yesterday, but did anything surprise you yesterday at all about the election?
There were some state rep and state Senate candidates who I was very surprised and disappointed didn't win. Folks who I campaigned with, folks who were running for the first time but brought energy and enthusiasm, professional skills and background, connections to their community, who I had really hoped would be elected. But more broadly, statewide, the re-election of Governor Markell, Lieutenant Governor Dinn, Senator Carper, Congressman Carney, I was not surprised at all that they won by very strong margins because they're great public servants. These are folks who are really rooted in Delaware, who govern in a way that reflects our values, who work together as a team. I'm really blessed to have the opportunity to serve with them and was not surprised that they won. And I think it's a good thing for Delaware.
Are you ready as we move past Election Day? Now the tough work begins for everybody with the fiscal cliff looming. Do you think the Senate is ready to deal with it and solve this?
I think we are. I was encouraged to hear both from Governor Romney and from President Obama in their speeches on election night a focus on problem solving, on moving past partisan politics and towards real solutions for our fiscal challenges. Where we've sat for most of the 2 years that I've served in the United States Senate is with both parties staking out positions and unwilling to come to the center. Now, I'm one of many Democrats, including Senator Carper, who've said repeatedly that we are willing to make some compromises to get to a big bipartisan solution, but everything has to be on the table. Some combination of new revenues, entitlement reform, defense cuts, and non-defense discretionary spending cuts, an across-the-board package. That's what the president's proposed a number of times. But there's a fairly rigid insistence, particularly on the part of the Republicans in the House, on no new revenue of any kind, even by allowing tax cuts to expire or by closing tax loopholes or tax expenditures. We've got a very real challenge facing our economy and our country coming up at the end of this calendar year when a whole series of different tax cuts or tax loopholes or tax benefits expire. This is what's called the fiscal cliff. And what most coverage focuses on is the scheduled return to the income tax rates for the wealthiest Americans that were prevalent during the Clinton era. But there's lots of other things, estate tax, the alternative minimum tax, changes in the capital gains tax. So it's actually a pretty broad range of tax changes. The only good news I can think of about this is that if we actually go over this fiscal cliff, we'll significantly address our deficits because we'll have a lot of new federal revenue. But it's a really bad way to do it. And there's lots of organizations and businesses and families who've contacted me or my office to express real concern. And I think we ought to use this moment to come together after the election to put on the table a balanced and reasonable plan and to find a solution that will give certainty to businesses, to families, to the marketplace, and that will allow the American economy to grow more rapidly.
Well, obviously it's not your job to give the opposition advice, but why do you think it's so hard for Republicans today to win voters here in Delaware?
I can't give them great advice, but the insights I'll offer is that nationally, and I think this is reflected locally, they have been perceived as being more against than for. They've spent a lot of the last 2 years being fairly stridently against the Affordable Care Act, against the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform or Financial Services Reform Act. And in particular, there seems to be sort of a personal animosity towards the president and an unwillingness to compromise or to negotiate on anything. That's not been positive because most folks in Delaware, even really rabid Democrats, ask me to compromise. They want us as legislators, that's what legislation is, to engage in principled compromise. There are certain areas that sort of define the Democratic Party or that define my core values that I'm not going to compromise on easily. But there's others that have to do with financial policy, tax cuts or spending cuts, tax increases or spending increases. That's an area where we ought to be able to put everything on a table and recognize that no one's going to be completely happy with the solution and find a path forward. A small but determined group in the Senate and the House of Republicans have refused to negotiate or compromise. We nearly went over The debt ceiling, as we were talking about last August of 2011, we nearly had the American bond rating downgraded by the financial institutions. We nearly had to shut down the entire federal government last March. So we've had a number of these sort of high stakes, high wire games that erode confidence in Congress's ability to work together and get things done. In the Senate, we are still passing bipartisan bills, the Farm Bill, the Highway Bill, but when they go over to the House, they either don't get taken up at all or we're unable to get them moved. That's been a real challenge for us, and I think that's a challenge for the Republican Party and for their brand.
You sort of hit on this. It seems like January 2009, there's a number of Republicans, House and Senate, that sort of decided that their mission over the next 4 years would be to stop what we saw this week with President Obama being reelected. Now that he's in for a second term, are you optimistic that maybe those Republicans will be more willing to work now that their sort of effort to stop an Obama second term has been unsuccessful? Do you think there's going to be more cooperation now?
Well, I'm hopeful. I have to be. I have to be an optimist to do this job. And I think I represent an optimistic state, and a state where we have a long tradition of working well together across regions, across interests, and across party lines. I've invested a lot of time and effort in building personal friendships with Republican senators, in co-sponsoring legislation on tax and trade, on immigration, on intellectual property, on manufacturing, and in working through those bills have found a dozen Republicans who I'm comfortable working with. The larger challenge is our caucus leadership. It was Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican, the minority leader in the Senate, who famously said, "I am determined to make Barack Obama a one-term president." Right. So the question is, going forward, will Senator Harry Reid, who's the majority leader of my caucus, and Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, the minority leader of the Republican caucus, will they come together and hammer out a path forward? We need their support, and we need presidential leadership to make progress on the budget. There's a significant number of younger or newer Democrats and Republicans who have tried to hammer out some path forward or some compromise. But if the leadership of both caucuses is opposed to progress, we really can't get that far, particularly in a body where the rules make it quite difficult to get anything introduced to the floor, to move anything forward, and where there have been so many filibusters and so many procedural log jams. So given initial statements after the election, given some things that Leader Reid has said about his eagerness to move forward, given some things we've heard from President Obama right after the election and in his victory speech, I'm optimistic that at least from my party, there is a real willingness to compromise moving forward. The question is, how much are we going to get in terms of a partnership from Speaker Boehner and from others in leadership in the House? The House of Representatives remains solidly in Republican hands, and if they're not willing to move somewhat on revenue in some way, we're going to have a very hard time coming to any responsible compromise.
All right, Delaware Senator Chris Coons, thanks so much for joining us on First Person this week.